Episode 1: What Caused WW2? The Treaty of Versailles Explained. Hook, September 1939. The world goes to war for the second time in 25 years. Over the next 6 years, more than 70 million people will die. Cities will be erased, empires will collapse, the map of the world will be redrawn from scratch. But this war, the most destructive in human history, did not begin in 1939. It began in the gilded halls of the Palace of Versailles, with a peace treaty that was supposed to end war forever. It did the opposite. The world after the Great War. To understand why the Second World War happened, you first have to understand the world left behind by the First. 4 years of industrial slaughter, 17 million dead, a generation of young men buried in the mud of France and Belgium. By November 1918, 4 empires had collapsed. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman and Russian empires, gone. The old order of Europe had been shattered beyond recognition. The victorious powers, France, Britain, the United States and Italy, now faced a question that would define the century. What do you do with a defeated Germany? France, which had suffered most on the Western Front, had a simple answer: crush them. Make sure Germany could never wage war again. Britain was more cautious. A destroyed Germany might create a dangerous power vacuum in the heart of Europe. And American President Woodrow Wilson had an idealistic vision, a just peace based on his 14 points, including the right of peoples to self-determination and a League of Nations to prevent future wars. These 4 men, known as the Big Four, would negotiate the fate of Europe in Paris in 1919. Their disagreements would produce a treaty that satisfied almost nobody. The Paris Peace Conference. The Paris Peace Conference opened in January 1919. Germany was not invited to negotiate. That fact alone tells you everything about the spirit of the agreement that followed. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, known as the Tiger, dominated the proceedings. He had lived through 2 German invasions of France in his lifetime. He was not in a forgiving mood. His goal was simple. Germany must be weakened so severely that it could never threaten France again. Germany would pay. Germany would disarm. Germany would lose territory. Wilson pushed for a moderate peace, but was constrained by his own Congress, which was increasingly hostile to European entanglement. Lloyd George of Britain sat somewhere in the middle. He wanted Germany punished enough to satisfy his voters at home, but not so punished that it collapsed into Bolshevism. After 6 months of negotiations, arguments and backroom deals, the result was the Treaty of Versailles. It was signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand that had started the whole catastrophe. The Germans called it the Diktat, the dictated peace. The terms of the treaty. So what exactly did the Treaty of Versailles say? Let's break it down, because each clause planted a seed of resentment that would take root over the next 20 years. First, the War Guilt Clause. Article 231, perhaps the most consequential paragraph in modern history. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for causing the war. All of it, Germany and Germany alone. To Germans of every political stripe, monarchists, socialists, liberals, this was a lie, an insult. The war had been caused by the interlocking alliance systems of all the great powers. Germany had not started it alone. The War Guilt Clause was not just morally questionable, it was the legal foundation for everything else that followed. Because Germany was guilty of starting the war, Germany would pay for it. The final reparations bill, set in 1921, came to 132 billion gold marks, a staggering sum equivalent to several trillion dollars today. Germany had lost the war. Its economy was already in ruins. Now it was expected to pay an astronomical deproc. BT to the victors. This economic stranglehold would fuel inflation, unemployment, and political instability throughout the 1920s and beyond. Then came the territorial losses. Germany lost approximately 13% of its territory and 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. The Rhineland was demilitarized and occupied by Allied troops. The Polish corridor was carved out to give the new state of Poland access to the sea, cutting East Prussia off from the rest of Germany. Danzig, a majority German city, was made a free city under League of Nations supervision. The Saar was placed under international control for 15 years, its coal mines handed to France. Germany's overseas colonies were stripped away entirely. For Germans, every one of these losses was a wound. Millions of ethnic Germans now lived outside Germany's borders under foreign rule. Finally, military restrictions. The German army was limited to just 100,000 men. No air force, no submarines, no tanks. Germany, a nation of 65 million people, was forbidden from defending itself. Why the treaty failed? Here is the central tragedy of Versailles. The treaty was harsh enough to humiliate Germany, but not harsh enough to permanently incapacitate it. France had wanted to break Germany apart, divide it into smaller states, as it had been before Bismarck unified it in 1871. Clemenceau was overruled, so Germany remained a unified nation-state of 65 million people, the largest single ethnic group in Europe, with its industrial base largely intact. The treaty created maximum resentment with insufficient ability to enforce it long term. And enforcement depended on the continued cooperation of the Allied powers. That cooperation would not last. The United States Senate refused to ratify the treaty. America retreated into isolationism. Wilson's League of Nations, his great hope for international order, was left without its most powerful potential member. Britain, exhausted and economically drained, had necked unshaken. Oh, appetite for permanent continental policing. That left France alone, anxious, and facing a Germany that, once it recovered, would inevitably seek to revise the treaty. The economist John Maynard Keynes, who attended the conference and resigned in protest, wrote prophetically in 1919 that the policy of reducing Germany to servitude for a generation was not just abominable, it was stupid. He was right. Germany's reaction, the birth of bitterness. In Germany, the treaty was received with shock, humiliation, and fury. The German public had been told by their government that the war was going well, even as it collapsed. The sudden armistice of November 1918 came as a total surprise to millions of ordinary Germans. How could Germany have been defeated? Its armies had never been driven back onto German soil. This gave rise to a poisonous myth, the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back legend. Germany hadn't been defeated in the field, the story went. It had been betrayed from within, by socialists, by Jews, by the politicians who signed the armistice, men who became known as the November criminals. It was a lie, but lies, when they explain a wound this deep, spread fast. The men who signed the armistice and accepted the Versailles terms were associated, fairly or not, with national humiliation. The democratic Weimar Republic, born in defeat, was tainted from its very first day. Into this toxic atmosphere, economic misery, political chaos, nationalist rage, stepped a generation of radical politicians who promised to reverse Versailles. One of them was an Austrian-born former corporal who had served on the Western Front. His name was Adolf Hitler. But that is a story for the next episode. Outro. The Treaty of Versailles did not make the Second World War inevitable. History is never inevitable. There were moments in the years that followed when different choices could have been made, when the peace could have been salvaged. But the treaty created the conditions, economic despair, national humiliation, political instability, from which extremism could grow. It handed demagogues a ready-made grievance. It gave them a villain to blame and a promise to make. We will tear up this shameful treaty. We will restore Germany's greatness. We will take back what was stolen. That promise would prove irresistible. 20 years, that's all the peace of Versailles would buy. 20 years, and then the world burned again. Next episode, the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. If you want to follow this story all the way through, every campaign, every turning point, every decision that changed history, subscribe now. This is WW2, The Complete History.